Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Kwasi Kwarteng, and I will be introducing the panel very shortly. I'm very pleased to be here. It's an incredible crowd that we've got. So let's hope that we have an interesting discussion and lots of lively questions. Aminatta Forna is an award-winning novelist and also a writer of non-fiction. Her father was Sierra Leonean, and her mother is Scottish, so she has a very interesting background. And she's one of the biggest talents, actually, to come out of Africa and Scotland in the last 10 years. And her books have been very well received, and I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Mary Harper is the BBC Africa editor. She's just written a book on Somalia, and asking what went wrong, or whether we're getting Somalia wrong now. I think that's the title of the book, Getting Somalia Wrong, question mark. And she is a very well-regarded journalist on African affairs. Anjan Sundaram is an Indian. He proudly tells me he has an Indian passport, and he studied in India, and he also studied at Yale University, where very surprisingly to me, given his subsequent career, he read mathematics. Having read mathematics successfully, he then became a journalist and is now, he went to the Congo. He's written about the Congo, and his book, Stringer, A Reporter's Journey in the Congo, is coming out this year. Now, just to kick off, I was just wondering what your most vivid impression of Africa has been in the last 3 or 4 years, the last time you've been there. And I think I'll address it to Anjan to start.
Sure, thank you, Kwasi. Soon after I arrived in Congo, I met these street children. And those were I had my most vivid experiences with them, among my most vivid experiences. I met them at a cemetery in the middle of Kinshasa. And in this cemetery were piles of garbage. And these children had been abandoned and had taken up residence in this area. They would drink water off of pools on the ground. And they had a terrible story. They had often been abandoned by their families who could not afford to feed them. And the families would take them to churches, and these children would be tortured until they confessed to being possessed by the devil. And once they had confessed, the families would abandon them, and these children formed little tribes. And I spent time with them in this cemetery. And I went in thinking, as I went into Congo thinking, I went in thinking that I would see just suffering and just pain. But the experience was quite different. These children were being just children in a sense. They were having fun at a very superficial level, of course, but they were enjoying themselves. They were drinking, they were smoking, they were engaging in pleasure. And I found this very disconcerting, not only because of the horrific story and experience that they had endured, but also because there's something of them in all of us. And if we had not gone to school, if we didn't have parents, we might become something quite like them. And I found that very fundamental in some way. And you strip away all the culture, and you see human beings for what they are and what they might do without civilization. So that was something that really struck me.
Mary?
Yeah, I thought I'd just briefly talk about the last time I went to Mogadishu in Somalia. I went there at the end of last year. And for the first time, I've been going there for nearly 20 years. And for the first time, it was no longer a city of front lines. I didn't have to wear a flak jacket and a helmet. But the way that the media had been talking about Somalia was that they were kind of giving the impression that now the war's finished and everybody's going to the beach. And that certainly wasn't what I saw. There was still pretty much constant gunfire. There were regular gun battles between different groups of people. So even though it wasn't that city absolutely at war with itself, it was still a much more unstable place than the kind of new narrative on Somalia is leading us to believe. So it was a very contradictory experience.
Aminatta?
I was last year I had a rather different experience from the other two panelists. I was teaching creative writing in Nigeria, in Lagos. And I had a group of young people who had all applied for this workshop, and they had been sponsored by a bank. They were able to come for free. The writers had flown over. I was teaching creative non-fiction, which people had very little idea of what it was. They all wanted to do poetry and fiction. But I introduced them to nature writing, travel writing, memoir, and I was so extraordinarily moved by both their enthusiasm and the quality of their output, but also by what I saw happening in Nigeria, which was this, I guess, kind of writing back, reclaiming, or perhaps claiming for the first time, and the image of Africa, and telling their own narratives. There was an incredible enthusiasm for that.
I was just wondering, it's very interesting hearing Mary's point of view in terms of you're suggesting that our picture of Somalia is rosier than actually is what's happening at the ground. What I wanted to pick up was this idea that Africa was going through a renaissance. You see that sometimes written up. And that if we'd been here 10 years ago, if there'd been a festival here 10 years ago, we would have been talking, I think, in much bleaker language, much bleaker terms about the future of the continent. I was just wondering what your thoughts were about the level of optimism that you've been seeing in your travels in Africa. Mary?
There's absolutely no denying it that Africa has, over the past 7 or 8 years, been growing economically at an incredible rate, at least some countries in Africa. There's a growing middle class. There's lots of exciting things like Aminatta was talking about in terms of literature, business, all sorts of things. But I have this fear now that just as patronizing and simplistic as the old picture of Africa was, which was kind of coined by The Economist, that Africa, the hopeless continent. Sure. We now have The Economist telling us that it's Africa rising, and a lot of the writing that's coming out about Africa, especially the journalism, even about a place like Somalia, which was always considered the world's most dangerous country, it was always labeled as the worst place on earth. It's almost like, I think it's gone too far in the other direction. So I think it is quite patronizing to say that Africa is rising.
So you don't
and
think
leaving
it is
at
rising?
that. There are bits of it that are rising. But I think it's too simplistic just to say Africa's rising.
And what is your view, Anand? I mean, you're, as I understand, your take is slightly perhaps gloomier than a lot of the current writing about Africa is at the moment.
Actually, Congo, where I worked, was doing much better over the past 4 or 5 years than it was reported in the media. And the media completely missed this story. And now they've again jumped on the story because there's a new rebellion in Congo, which I went to visit 2 weeks ago. But the media has come back to Congo because of this rebellion, and they've missed the 4 or 5 years during which things were improving. And so it's perpetuated this image of Congo as the hopeless, the heart of darkness, and a hopeless country. There is progress, it's just not reported often enough.
I understand this is a problem with the media, though, not with Africa. Okay. I mean, it's either overstating it or they're understating it, and it just seems to me extraordinary how often. I mean, can I ask a question of the audience? Could you put up your hand if you have been to Africa south of the Sahara?
Slightly more than you anticipated.
Yeah, that is more. I mean, so often we have this discussion. If I'm in Britain somewhere, I'm having a discussion, and you're actually having it in an information vacuum because everybody is basing their experience on what they've read in the papers or what they've seen on television. I worked for the BBC for 10 years, and I remember going to my then editor with a story about a place called Darfur nobody had heard about. And I was trying to persuade him to, let me investigate it. And after a few attempts, he turned around to me and he said, look, Middle England is not interested in Africa. And I guess he did me such a favour because that was the point when I decided to leave the BBC. and to start to write about Africa and think about Africa. And because I just thought we were telling the stories the wrong way, and we're telling them the same stories, and we are shamelessly misrepresenting something. And so, that's really why I became a writer of memoir and novels, because it seemed to me that was just about the only way you could get to the truth of something. So Africa has a terrible image problem, but so much of it is about how the media do their job. Let's not forget that.
Can I just pick up on that? A lot of my reporting is on Somalia, and last year, in a very peaceful part of Somalia called Somaliland, they had a literature festival that in some ways was very similar to this, but it was tiny. There were kind of that many people rather than all of you. But it was a fantastic, unexpected event, and I thought a wonderful story that I wanted to report on for the BBC. And just like Aminatta, I went to my editors and I said, I want to go and report on this, and they wouldn't let me. And it was just maddening, because all they want is for me to go and report on that standard image of Somalia.
It's just very interesting. I mean, all three of you have been in the past or are now journalists. So you're very much part of the media. I mean, the media, in a way, created you. I just wanted to understand, why do you think the media has this persistent negative image? Is it a colonial legacy? Is it pure sort of racism? Or why do you think that these negative images are still being peddled to this day? Aminatta?
Oh boy. I mean, you probably have to ask a peddler of them. I think playing to the audience. I think that's the big problem. And actually, I think that a lot of the media misjudge and underestimate their audience. But I think it is playing to existing or perceived prejudices, thinking inside the lines. I mean, one of the things, let me just say quick, one of the things that is happening in social media, which I've really noticed, is, first of all, Africans becoming aware of this image, because Africans inside Africa who haven't left the continent were not as aware as those of us who move between the worlds of this image. And they've become increasingly aware of it, increasingly sensitive to it. And the other day, somebody sent me a brilliant YouTube video. The most hated song and everywhere I've ever been on the African continent is Do They Know It's Christmas? And somebody sent me a video, and it was made by Kenyan musicians, and it was a spoof, and it was to raise money to send blankets to Norway in the winter.
It's very good. Very.
Can I respond to that,
sure.
actually? Two things. We're all talking about Africa like it is a country, and there is this notion that Africa is a dark continent, just one piece. I think Mary hinted at the fact that different parts of Africa have completely different stories, experiencing change of a different nature, different speeds. There are parts of Africa that are doing well, progressing, but it's surprising. Congo is the worst war in the world today. And each time you write that 5 million people have died in Congo, it seems like a revelation.
Sure.
And people still are not informed enough about the horrific nature of the war in Congo. And if you go into the Congo, the lives of people are still determined by the war. They try to...
Forgive me. I mean, the point I was going to make was that obviously there are different parts of Africa. I mean, Aminatta and my tradition, if you like, our families, come from the western part of Africa. And that's a very different experience to what you saw in the Congo. Which leads me to my question to you. What drew you to the Congo? I mean, clearly it has a very bad image, the heart of darkness, lots of conflict. And yet you, with your stellar degree from Yale, decided that this was the place that you wanted to write about and make a living from. And that seems like a sort of paradoxical choice. I just wanted to see whether you could explain that, really.
Sure. I was 22 at the time. I'd studied mathematics. I'd studied a lot of mathematics. And the short answer is 4 million people back then, now it's 5 million. 4 million people had died, and I wanted to see. That's the short answer. I lived in this world that was very beautiful. America, mathematics. It was proof of man's genius in some sense. And I wanted to see the other side of man. I wanted to see what we were capable of in our violence, in our aggression, and all of that. I felt it was very personal.
I mean, listening as an African or someone listening to this, it sounds like a you were some sort of tourist trying to get a thrill. I mean, a critic might say this is a sort of form of voyeurism. You know, there you were at Yale, sorry, not Harvard, you know, doing wonderful, beautiful mind equations. And you thought, oh, I want to go and see something really violent. And I think I'll go to the Congo and sort of prod and poke. And that seems like a rather bizarre attitude. I mean, I've written a lot about empire. And your attitude, actually, is quite similar to the ones of people in about 1850.
Certainly,
thinking,
certainly.
you know, leaving Oxford and saying, what I want to do is go to Sudan and sort of see how the natives live. I mean, it's a very odd, I think, motivation, but
Sure.
interesting that you should be so frank in admitting it.
Oh, no, I think
And I just wanted, at this point, to draw in Mary. Obviously, you work for the hallowed BBC, and I was just wondering whether these imperial attitudes were what drove you to write about the Dark Continent.
I think my story is a bit different from Anjan's. I was brought up in Kenya, and I think in some ways, even though I'm not Kenyan, my mum's American, my dad's British, I could never really leave it. I was sent to boarding school in the UK, but I just kept on going back to Africa. But I definitely grapple with this whole thing about me, a white Western woman. Like, what right do I have to write a book about Somalia? What right do I have to report on Africa? For a long time, I worked for a radio program called Focus on Africa that was only for an African audience. And I'm always asking people, like, in fact, I got an email yesterday from a Somali friend of mine, an MP, who was talking about this whole problem of what he described as the Western gaze on Africa. So I wrote back to him and I said, does that mean that I don't have the right to report on Africa? And he said, no, absolutely not. But it is something I definitely feel uncomfortable about it. And it would be interesting to know whether you or Aminatta think that I'm some kind of horrible colonial imposter that I would dare to try to write about a continent that's not my own.
Well, I've done my bit about imperialism, so I'll leave that to Aminatta. What do you think? Is Mary a horrible colonialist?
As a writer, I mean, you know, as a writer, we get asked this kind of question all the time. And I absolutely believe anybody can write about anything. That's the full stop, right? You can write about what you want to write about. But I would say that my motivation in writing, I guess, is writing about Africa is twofold, because I suppose before I became a writer, when I dreamed of writing novels, they were sort of novels like, you know, everybody else I knew around me was writing, set somewhere in London, featuring people quite like us. And I guess two things. One, of course, we had a war, and it was impossible not to write about it, really. And then I wrote about it in the form of non-fiction, and then I realized that fiction gave another kind of truth. So that was my real motivation. But one of the things that I found in writing about setting stories in an African country was, well, nobody knew where it was. I mean, Sierra Leone has no economic, political, regional importance whatsoever. Everyone keeps confusing it with Sri Lanka. But I went to Sri Lanka, and they said, oh, people keep confusing us with Sierra Leone. But you know, part of what I have discovered is I'm constantly writing against something. You know, if I set something in Sierra Leone, for one part of my audience, which is my Western readers, I'm constantly writing against something, and that is a very deeply held presumption that everything and everybody in this place is rather bad. And my African readers, from wherever they come in Africa, don't have that response. And so it has actually shaped my writing in a way that I wish it hadn't.
I just wanted to pick up on something you said about fiction and non-fiction. Obviously, I mean, I've written non-fiction about Africa and India and other places, but how does writing fiction, I think you said or you suggested it frees you up, it gives you more license, if you like. How has that changed your writing in terms of the fiction against the non-fiction?
Well, I mean, fiction tells you a deeper truth, really. It goes to a deeper level. And of course, with fiction, you can create characters and you can go inside their heads. I mean, probably the closest form would be documentary making, which I did when I was at the BBC, where you try to get people to talk about their experience on camera. But in fiction, of course, your reader inhabits the lives of the narrator, of the characters, in a way that they simply can't with either non-fiction or certainly news reporting. And of course, you don't have, an editor telling you no one's interested in Middle England.
It's very good. But in terms of, I mean, you're going to the journalists. I mean, do you think? I mean, to what extent have your views of Congo or Africa changed over the time that you've actually been a reporter? I mean, clearly you were drawn to this very disordered world. But have your views changed over the time you've reported on it?
Absolutely. I think when you go into a place like Congo, you're 22 and you want to see the world, you're going in to find things that you had not experienced before, and Africa certainly gives you those. I lived with a poor family in Kinshasa for a year and a half, and I saw every day their struggle, their joys, their happiness. And in Congo, life can become so dire that people resort to humor to overcome and surmount their situation. And you'll find the bars are lively and full. They will go till 6 a.m. The music is inventive, innovative. It draws you in. The dances are creative. You really have a good time enjoying with them.
I mean, obviously you went there expecting bloodshed and mayhem, and you had a few beers. That was quite, and you enjoyed that. But what was the most surprising thing? The single most surprising thing about it?
The humor.
Was it the humor? Okay,
Yeah,
not
the
the
humor.
nightlife. And the fact that people enjoyed.
No,
that.
no. It's the humor. It's a fact that their humor is both funny, but it's also sad. They make fun of themselves, and to some extent, I write about an Africa that Africa today may not want to read anymore because it's been written
Lots
about.
of times.
Yes, and unfortunately, Congo, again experiencing this rebellion, is in bad shape. But I think these places tell us something about humanity that few other places in the world
So
do.
you've got a broader.
And it's very important to go to these places.
And I just was interested in your experience of Kenya. I mean, you were sent to a British boarding school, but was your experience of Kenya something that did you have a nostalgic view of Kenya? I mean, clearly, having been sent from there at a young age must have romanticized in some way your view of that country.
Yeah, definitely, because my memories as a child are those kind of ones you see on TV. My parents used to take me on safari
Sure.
and go to the beautiful beaches. So there was all of that very simplistic, over-romanticized view. But I think in terms of probably different from this experience was because I kept on going back to Africa. I spent lots of time. I lived in Senegal for quite a long time, and I've reported from lots and lots of different countries for the BBC. There was never really this big clash between what I expected of Africa
Sure.
and what I experienced, because I go there. I mean, every 2 months I'm somewhere in Africa.
Sure.
But I mean, one thing, especially with Somalia, was because of this dominant media narrative on Somalia as being, it has all the ingredients of an African disaster zone plus pirates. So
Sure.
it's just, the best.
That's the best, yes.
Yeah, and then in fact, from all the time that I've spent there was this huge mismatch. All of those things were there, but there were also the fact that, for example, Africa's biggest money transfer company is based there. Somalia exports more live animals than any other country in the world. There were all these other things going on that were just not being reported, and that's why I wrote my book, because I felt it's not just unfair on Somalia, but it actually is leading to really misguided foreign policy that has, 20 years of a country that hasn't functioned, and a lot of that was because the foreign powers that were trying to sort Somalia out had completely the wrong image of what was happening there.
I just want to put you on the spot, really. I mean, I think a lot of these ideas very much see Africa as a victim in terms of, the victims of colonialism, victims of natural disasters. And some hard-headed people in the West would say, well, actually, it's time that Africa sorted out its own problems. And to what extent do you think the problems, some of the negative images, are about failure of government in post-colonial Africa? I mean, to what extent, to put it brutally, is the fault, the problems of Africa, the fault of the African leaders themselves, the peoples themselves? Do you think that's a fair question?
Yeah, I think in terms of politics, a lot of African countries, let's take Kenya, for example, which is growing. It has a big middle class doing exciting, inventive things, incredibly dynamic. And they're doing that not because their government is encouraging them to do that, but despite their government. I keep on thinking that a lot of these countries that are doing well is despite government rather than because of government. You also said something about Africa being seen as a victim. Sometimes I think that's quite useful for some African countries because they get all these NGOs flooding in, and they've actually become very, very good at exploiting the NGOs to their own advantage.
Aminatta, have you got a view on that?
Well, on
NGOs?
too many to share. I do have some strong views on aid, but I don't know whether this is the time to air them because I can sometimes not stop. But I don't think. I mean, aid is an industry, and it is an industry that has not necessarily been created or being run for the benefit of people in Africa or in any other poor country in the world. And I think we should just be a lot more honest about aid and what drives it, which is really opening up markets and, quite often keeping in with the government that best suits the companies in your country's business interest. And I'm sort of deeply cynical about aid, both for the reasons that Mary's talked about. The governments have become quite good in Africa at getting it. One of the in Sierra Leone, one of the party who was recently elected, one of their campaigning points was, Britain has offered us this amount of money. So it's creating a culture of dependency. But at the same time, there's a wonderful book by a woman called Linda Pullman called War Games, which I would point you all to, about the level of the aid industry and who is benefiting from it.
Sure, just to respond to that, absolutely, Africans are responsible for their countries and they should take their countries by the horn. If the African leaders don't help their own people, then it's very difficult for them to sit down and blame the foreigners, though the foreigners, as Mary and Aminatta have pointed out, do have a lot of blame to shoulder.
But let's talk about this issue of the Congo, because the Congo is very much, I think, in the back of people's minds when they think of the Dark Continent. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was Joseph Conrad wrote The Heart of Darkness, which is all about a trip there. And it seems that its problems are very deep-rooted. Given your background as a clearly a very capable mathematician and an analyst, you've got a shrewd analytical brain. Why has the Congo been such a problem in the last 20 years?
And Congo, it was to kill, there was a leader in Congo, the independence hero, Patrice Lumumba, and he was killed with the help of Western powers. And to kill a person like Lumumba was to kill someone like Gandhi in India, just after independence, and also Nehru. He represented that to Congo, and I think Congo didn't quite recover from that. Congo is very rich, and a lot of people want the money there. And despite the efforts of the people to redress their country, there are too much interest, and there's too much at stake, and people benefit from the conflict there, which is the sad story in Congo.
I mean, that's quite a radical idea. I mean, you're suggesting that the conflict, the tensions are being perpetuated to further commercial interests.
Yes, I was in the rebel zone 2 weeks ago, and this rebellion has gone on and on for 15 years, under new names, new leaders, but it's always backed by the same power, Congo's neighbors, who are backed by Western countries. And the interest, there is only one big interest in Eastern Congo, and that's minerals. Congo, though it's extremely violent in the east, it has to be said that 80% of Congo, roughly, has no government, has no judicial system, no police, and yet is largely at peace. I think Jean-Jacques Rousseau would be quite pleased. It's
Sure.
proof of something good in man.
Let's all have an anarchy. Is that the the conclusion? I mean, I just want to talk about this idea of governance, and it's the fault of the Africans. I mean, to what extent do you think the colonial experience can still be blamed? It's another way of looking at it. I mean, do you in your reporting look back to the imperial past in terms of the Congo or Somalia? I mean, how does that inform your reporting today?
So
history.
I explain the history because I think it's important to understand the country, but I try to base my reporting on my own experience and not on prejudice, not on preformed opinions. So I try to live in Congo and try to base what I write on what I have lived through. And I think that's very important as a reporter. Most of the people I talk to had never talked to a reporter before. They never have their voice heard. And I think they were both excited and grateful in a certain sense to share their world with an outsider.
Aminatta?
I think it's very unfashionable to blame colonialism now, and there is always this blame game. It's your fault. No, it's not. It's your fault. But I think that the impact of colonialism, and I feel it very strongly when I'm in a country like India, where I see the same sort of long-term shape of the historical and political narrative, is about getting a new democracy, is about trying to make that democracy work. And when we talk about Africa as a continent, when I do, I'm thinking of the interconnectedness of that experience, where, you know, virtually every country apart from Ethiopia had a moment where suddenly they had a Western-style, Westminster-style democratic structure that they had to, given to them, which they had to learn to use. And one mustn't forget, of course, that Britain didn't rule. None of the colonial powers ruled democratically. So no one had actually seen this democracy. Sure. When I come to India, I think, okay, what happened here was you went through the same kind of shape process that we did. But where I think the big problem for a lot of the African countries have is not having a middle class, because it's ultimately the middle class, which is now growing there, but it is ultimately the middle class that hold the government accountable. I mean, in Sierra Leone, the government basically went out to loot. So when people say African governments, they don't work, oh yeah, they do. They work for someone, it depends what your purpose is. And they are usually held accountable when they, in countries where things work and the government is heading that way by the middle class. And I think that, Congo was this huge example where they only had one graduate. And in Sierra Leone, my father was part of a generation of people who became called by Wole Soyinka the Renaissance generation, because Britain and France, and realizing, and the other countries, but principally Britain, realizing the mess that was coming with independence without trained professionals, gave huge amounts of scholarships to promising young men and women to go to study to England and study. And Obama's father was one of the Renaissance generation. So, that's what was happening. And I think we see that is the case when we look at what's happening in Afghanistan and Iraq, that actually you can't just shove on a democracy and walk away and think it's going to work.
You mentioned your father. I just wanted to speak, if I may, ask you a personal question about, obviously, your father's experience in politics, and you speak a lot about that in your first book. To what extent did that early experience of tragedy shape your writing?
Well, it probably shaped my entire life, I should think.
Do you want to talk a bit about that?
What do I have to say? Well, for those who don't know, my father was a political prisoner, and he was executed when I was 11 years old. He was a pro-democracy activist and a doctor, medical doctor, part of the generation. And when Anjan was talking about Lumumba, I think that he really did put his finger on something that happened on that continent, actually. There was a dream, and the dream died, and the Renaissance generation on the whole really did. They disappeared, they either were killed, they were imprisoned, they were exiled. So there was this terrible moment when everything seemed lost. The first book that I wrote really was a memoir. Well, it is a memoir of my father, and it was prompted by the war in Sierra Leone, because he had said it was going to happen. He'd had that foresight, and he'd written a document just on the eve of his execution, and he said, if we carry on down this path, we will end up with the end of the rule of law and with war. And that document wasn't discovered until some 20-odd years afterwards, when we were in the depths of war. And it was so extraordinary that somebody had foreseen it. And that, yes, at the same time, everybody around me was saying, well, nobody knew this was going to happen. We didn't see it coming. And so I guess it has been a recurrent theme in my writing. Certainly in The Memory of Love, it's about individual responsibility and how much each of us holds that responsibility to hold our government accountable in our own actions, and at that point when inaction turns into complicity. So I would say it's informed a great deal of my writing.
And I just, before I throw the conversation to the audience, I just wanted to ask Anjan and Mary, to what extent do you think that there is light at the end of the tunnel? I mean, do you think that people in Africa are taking on board this message of individual responsibility and not simply looking as victims to aid and to the West, if you like, to improve the continent?
Yeah, I wonder whether, you talked about that sort of first post-colonial generation in terms of being Renaissance. And that's a word that is coming up again in descriptions of Africa. You hear it about the Renaissance of African literature, the economy, and I wonder whether, without being too idealistic about it, whether maybe now, after going through convulsions and coups and civil wars, whether now is the time for the true African Renaissance to start. I don't know. One thing that worries me is that we're seeing one of the reasons why Africa's getting rich now is because places like China and India are rushing in, getting the natural resources out and doing some very useful things like building roads instead of doing gender awareness projects the Western organizations do. And I've seen the benefits of those roads in places like Ethiopia. People can actually get their fresh food to market in a hurry. But the fear is that those resources are being taken out raw, and there's not much manufacturing going on. And unless Africa starts taking responsibility for transforming those resources into something a few stages along, it's just going to be plundered like it was during the colonial period.
Anjan?
Sure, yeah. To answer your question, the Africans that I spent a lot of time with in Congo would probably be insulted by that question. They would probably say, of course we're trying to take care of ourselves. Sure. Of course we're trying to build our futures. They're like all of us.
Sure.
And
but do you see that happening on a national level? In terms of
absolutely,
individual, you think,
absolutely, people everywhere. People everywhere. They would say that question is born of a kind of disillusionment with Congo or with Africa in general. Sure. That's the difference between reading 400 words at the bottom of a newspaper about Congo or Africa and going there and meeting the people. And that's why I think writing based on lived experience, literature on foot, is so important.
Sure, good. I think now, there are lots and lots of issues that have been raised. So I'll be very pleased to take questions. And if you have questions, stick your hand up in the traditional way.
There's a gentleman on the left. If you turn to your left. Yes? Yes, sir? Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Audible?
Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Okay. I'm a geologist by profession. I work in the oil industry. Spent a lot of time working in East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, Madagascar, Uganda to an extent. You would say that East Africa relatively is peaceful. There isn't that many active conflicts going on, apart from places like Sudan and Somalia. There have been long-term problems there. But Tanzania and Uganda, and to an extent maybe the east side of Congo, the East Congolese border with Uganda, Lake Albert Basin and all. I worked there. And I worked there as a geologist, so I was in the middle of the conflict. And I was told that there's deep danger everywhere. I was told that don't go out by the lake after 4 o'clock and don't do things that you would really naturally do, because it was a beautiful place. It was the middle of a national park. It was just unbelievable. And I realized the drive, I'm sorry if I'm taking too much time, the drive from the camp to the rig site was about 5 minutes. And we had bulletproof vehicles, and we had a security company, private security company. A lot of the people working there were Britishers and Americans who served in their respective armies. and they were being employed by these huge private security companies that were being paid by these corporate interests in the country, the financial interest, the oil industry in particular. And for a 45-minute drive from A to B, my company was being charged $5,000 for one person. Hang on a sec. I'm sorry, I'm just going to finish very quickly.
Just
so
a quick
what I'm
question.
saying, you talked about the perpetuation of conflict, which has financial interest. I can confirm that because I'm a part of that. I work there. Do you not think all this media attention about Africa, about the social conflict, and you know, people are dying and how to rehabilitate people and the refugee crisis and all that, isn't that the biggest distraction really in dealing with the real problems? People are milking it everywhere, you know, and I really don't think things are really going to be any different in 20 years' time or 25 years' time. Books are being written, movies are being made. What is really actually being done? It's just talking and talking and talking. I mean, there was a lot of talking in the last 1 hour. What's really being changed?
Okay, then that's... I don't know where to begin with that. It's probably the longest question I've ever heard. But honest, turning to the panel, too much talk, not enough action. What's your view on that?
Okay, you start.
Okay. Just because he mentioned Eastern Congo, I think he's touched on two important points here. The first is that the outsider's experience of the war is completely different, and the outsider's experience of Africa in general is completely different to how the Africans, Congolese and Rwandese experience their own countries. We are in a position of privilege. We don't face the same circumstances, the same difficulties that they do. We can travel through conflict zones without much difficulty. And even in Rwanda, which is a country developing roads, buildings, the Rwandese are persecuted and repressed, and a foreigner may not necessarily see that. That's why it's so important to live with them and travel with them and go to their families. The second point, what is changing, I think the fundamental issues in Africa are governance, are the press, freedom to associate, civil society, and until those are able to take root in the middle class, as Aminatta mentioned, until those are allowed to flourish, it will be very difficult. Societies don't come about just because there is a good president. You need a society that is empowered, that is growing wealthier, that can live in security, and that can take charge of its own destiny.
That's a very good answer. Would any of the other panelists like to answer?
I think you touched on something that I've seen in other places. I don't know how genuinely dangerous it was in that place that you were talking about. It seems that it wasn't. And I've been to lots of places like that where UN workers and journalists and others, they say that it's very dangerous, partly because if you work for the UN, you get special extra money for working in a hostile environment. The private security companies charge thousands for that, and journalists look really brave and glamorous if they're like reporting from a war zone, when in fact they'll position themselves against some bullet scarred building that might have been shot up 20 years ago, and in fact the place is stable. So there's a lot of myth making about those very dangerous parts of Africa.
Do you want to? I think we'll, just as a housekeeping point, obviously say your penny worth, but obviously the shorter the questions, the more we can get through. So
Exactly
there's a
right.
balance there.
Exactly. We have a question over here from this young man.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Yeah, my question is like, in the next 10 years, can we expect some of the African nations to replicate the success model and growth model of India and China, or like, can Africa create the hype similar to Asia in the next 10-15 years?
It's a very direct question. Can Africa see some of the success that we've seen in China and India over the next 10 or 15 years? Mary?
I think so. Certainly some countries are already going that way, places like Ethiopia, Kenya, Ghana, and even some like Somalia. I sometimes think because it's an incredibly economically dynamic place, if they can sort out their politics and their conflict, they'll probably, in 5 years, they'll be way ahead of lots of other countries in East Africa. I can almost imagine them being the Dubai of East Africa.
I just wanted to make a point. You talk about India and India's success, but even now, in this shining India, Indians are leaving for Congo. There are Indians of certain social classes, certain castes, who feel they cannot access the new wealth that is being created in India. And I found them all over Congo. There were men who had come, men and women, who had come 2 years ago to seek their fortune. And when I talked to them, they were incredibly bitter about their Indian experience. They had bought pieces of land in the middle of the jungle, hoping to get rich. And there were these incredible stories, but why leave India if India is so successful? Maybe we need to look at our own country and examine it more closely.
Very interesting. Another question?
Yes, we have a lady over here, I believe. If you'd like to stand up, and then we have quite a few here in the centre. I'm going to get to as many of you as we can.
Thank you very much. I'm very interested when you speak about the reinvigoration of a lot of these societies that are riven by armed conflict. In relation to many of them, in particular the Congo, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, there has been an international justice response to it in the form of special tribunals or the International Criminal Court. What are you pessimistic or otherwise about the capacity of those initiatives to focus a debate about law and order and other aspects of reform domestically?
A very relevant question on international courts and how they can push forward an agenda, whether they're going to work.
I've got a problem with the International Criminal Court because I actually call it the African Criminal Court. It only ever picks African, sometimes pretty minor African rebel leaders.
Only Congolese.
Yeah, exactly. Plenty of
So it's
Congolese.
the Congolese court, is it?
Yeah. There's a few others as well. And there is a problem as well, if you look at the case of Uganda, where the Lord's Resistance Army, which is one of the most brutal rebel movements and long-lived, that hacks limbs, lips, ears, noses off people, its leader was pretty much ready to come out of his rebellion and settle with the government, but because he had been indicted by the International Criminal Court, he wouldn't do it at the last moment. So even though obviously justice is hugely important, at least in those African examples, it is very, very problematic.
Aminatta?
The special court in Sierra Leone, when I reported on it, I went to the opening, I followed the chief prosecutor around the country. It was an idea. It was backed by a lot of American money. There was an argument that America just didn't want the ICC to go ahead, so it was doing all these special deals. A lot of people in Sierra Leone were deeply disillusioned by it. Not surprisingly, it took a huge amount of time and it cost a huge amount of money. And if you saw what the lawyers who worked there were being paid, it was very hard to be supportive. One thing that did come out of it, I would say, was it gave an account of the war, and I think that was really important. You know, through the witnesses that testified, an account of and the investigations that were held in order to get that far. We actually got an account of the war so that we understood what had happened. And I thought that was terribly important. You know, this was going to be lost. We don't have a lot of historians. We don't have a lot of resources in that way. That was important. But the question also covered the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In Sierra Leone, that really didn't work at all. It was absolutely a superimposition and very hastily put together. It had no powers. People were incredibly disappointed that actually it just appeared that rebels who had done the most terrible things could just walk up to this court, say, hey, you know, I did it, and then it was all over. And what was extraordinary about it was that actually Sierra Leone, of any country I have ever seen after a war, has managed the greatest act of forgiveness, the most extraordinary act of forgiveness. And I came across a psychiatrist recently who was going out to Sierra Leone because they wanted to try to use the model of forgiveness that we had we have in our society, and we had managed to get over this war in order to try and see if it would work in places like Sri Lanka and Yugoslavia.
Thank you. Another question.
We have a young lady just here.
Thank you. Anjan, my question's for you. in the last 5 years or so, there's been a huge mobile boom in many countries in Africa. So it would be interesting to know of your experience there. How did mobiles sort of influence freedom? How did it improve or affect security in any way? Did it sort of induce civil society engagement and encourage people to sort of stay connected, communicate, and so forth?
Good question.
Yes, very good question. Thank you. The mobile sector is indeed one of the industries or sectors that's booming in Africa. It's kind of the beacon of African economies in many countries. And there are innovative initiatives that have originated in Africa. In fact, mobile payments were pioneered in some African countries. But in terms of furthering freedom, certainly the access to telephones has allowed people to converse with each other more easily. There's technology like Ushahidi that allows one to locate geographically reports of violence, for example, during elections, or access to water, or even a party. But I think though telecom has helped, it's still just a piece of the puzzle. And Africa's middle class needs much more than this. A lot of African countries will need sustained security and a middle class, a growing middle class, education, access to basic services. Telecom will certainly help with that. Communication helps, information helps. It's not the answer.
Thank you. Another question?
We have a young man over here.
Hi, ma'am. You mentioned a bit of cynicism with respect to the aid agencies that are working there. I work with the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, who has a bit of a strong foothold there. Do you believe that this sense of cynicism is a genuine one among the people who are recipients of that aid as well? And do you see, and what's the relevance of these organizations that you see in the next coming 5 to 10 years?
Aminatta, do you want to answer that question?
Is there cynicism on the ground? Yes, very much so. In Sierra Leone, I think people really wanted help after the war. So it was pretty astonishing to see how quickly, that hope faded, that actually the people who were working for NGOs were really in any way there to help the local people. I think one of the troubles is that people go with different expectations, and a lot of people who work for NGOs, young people, imagine victims to be one way, and victims can actually not be as endearing as you hope they're going to be. And so a lot of faith gets lost on either side. I mean, actually, I would say that your organisation is one of the ones that I very much rate. In fact, they helped my family during the war. But I think one of the things that really has caused a tremendous problem is the funding of very small agencies who go in with very little experience and who don't follow through. I have a friend who advises NGOs wanting to set up in Sierra Leone, and one of the things, first thing he says is don't bother, and the other thing when they ask what their biggest challenge is going to be, he says trust. Nobody trusts you. Because you come in, you make promises, and this has happened over and over again. I mean, there was a project, I'll tell you two things quickly actually. When Liberia sort of finally got to a position where the aid agencies could go there, I mean, the gravy train couldn't move fast enough out of Sierra Leone over to Liberia. All the aid agencies shipped out because Liberia was now where the money was. And I went round, I was doing a story at that time on the special court, and I asked every single person I met, whether it was because I was asking actually people about the special court. So I interviewed some working girls, some prostitutes, I interviewed a minister, I interviewed some street guys, I interviewed some professionals, and I asked every single one of them, have you seen a project, name an aid project that has worked? And not one of them could do it. Not one of them could do it. And, so it is that lack of trust. It's not being there in the long term. It's not consulting the people, and it is that sense that actually aid is this self-generating business.
Just to add to that, I think Aminatta is absolutely right when she's talking about long-term aid, but I think emergency aid has helped,
yeah, that's
certainly.
Relief aid.
Yes, relief aid. I think there's a distinction to be made between long-term development aid and aid when people are really really in dire straits when they have nothing left, well, after an earthquake, after tsunami.
Well, that has its own problems, but yes, there is a separation to be made.
I think we'll move to the next question, and I understand that we'll have time for 2 more questions.
Yeah, and there'll definitely be, hopefully, our authors going over to the book signing desk for any additional questions. I'm sorry, we only have time for a couple more.
Hi, my name is Mohsin Mansouri. I'm a diamond dealer.
Sorry.
Well, my question goes to directly anybody, especially the guy sitting on the left. And I've been to some part of Africa, especially in Tanzania and South Africa. Since he's from Congo, there are a lot of, I feel like Africa itself is the world's most richest continent in the world. If you source diamonds there, they're worth trillions of dollars. And I see a lot of Western countries, they are grabbing there. In fact, me, myself, going to Africa and getting there from De Beers also. So my question is to you, what do you feel as a guys going there in Africa, these diamonds and all the resources there are going to make them rich, or what has to be done there to make it more powerful?
I think, well, it's a good question. This is the perennial problem of Congo and many African countries. There's so much wealth, but there's no governance, there's no regulation. And private enterprise is useful. The market can be a good force, but the market needs to be regulated. One needs to make sure that the profits also reach society at large and not just the little boy who found the diamond in the stream, and even him hardly. And mostly it goes to the middleman. And there's no regulation, and this is the problem. And the diamond certification, Kimberley certification program has not helped an iota. It has done almost nothing.
Yeah.
Mary, do you have
I could just add, there's one country that seems to be trying to sort out diamonds in Africa a bit better than others, is Botswana, because they've actually moved to start polishing them there, which has taken some work away, I think, from India. But at least they're getting a hold of, their raw product and moving one stage further. But I think that, as far as I know, that's pretty much the only country that does that.
So
Namibia.
Namibia, okay.
India has actually promised to set up a diamond polishing center in Congo. They've promised this for the last 8 years. I went to Congo 8 years ago, and I met a diplomat there who had told me that they were going to set up a polishing center with expertise from Surat in Gujarat. It still hasn't happened.
Okay. I think this is
I think
the last.
we have one last question over on the left here.
question.
I'm so sorry to everyone that we didn't get to.
Is this on? I just wanted to address a comment that was sort of made in passing by Mary Harper. And this is not, to be contentious for the sake of being contentious, but you said something about roads and infrastructure and how that is more important than gender rights or gender awareness programs. And, being that in the Congo, rape is used systematically as a weapon of warfare, and women are subjugated, entire villages are subjugated in that way. Would you like to sort of address that sort of rephrase that statement, and because a lot of times, things that are perceived as important are more like roads and infrastructure and economics, and things that are related to women are often, sort of casually dismissed as less and trivial.
Okay.
I certainly don't think that roads and infrastructure are more important than women's issues, but I've been reporting on Africa and from Africa for 20 years, and it's very rare that I see any project to do with women that has made any difference to their lives. I mean, rape is still going on in Eastern Congo. It's been going on for years and years and years. And I see lots of organizations in Africa that set themselves up as NGOs, and they'll have, last year it was gender awareness, so they'll get their funding for that, and then you'll see a cross on the wall, and it'll be now anti-AIDS, and they just go for whatever is the fashion of the moment, and it's to do with, I'd love to hear of some of those projects that have actually made any difference.
As it's the last question, I'm going to throw, I know it was directed to Mary at that point, but I want to throw the question to the other panelists.
Well, actually, I'm going to stand up for Mary. Rape is a weapon of war everywhere. We know that from the former Yugoslavia, so it isn't specific to the Congo. But the other thing I would say about gender awareness programs, I agree with what Mary said actually. NGOs do just run through where they're going to get their next set of funding. But also, certainly in West Africa, we regard ourselves, we women, as extremely emancipated, very hard-working, and we don't think that actually Western agencies have anything that they can tell us about gender awareness.
Anjan?
Well, I'd like to add, perhaps, that there's a problem with aid programs that seem to target specific issues, women's issues, rape, when in fact the problem seems to be that people are unable to express their needs and desires as a group. And governance and helping Africa govern itself, that is what aid programs should be financing, and not little... I've seen aid programs that promote a press for handicapped people, press for women, press for poor people. Do we have a press for poor people in India? No, we don't have we have a press for everyone. And that's what Africa needs. Africa needs a government for everyone, a press for everyone. And sometimes focusing on individual issues is unhelpful. And where we really need broader structures and broader aid programs that help people govern themselves.
So we've really ended up where we were at the start in terms of governance being the key to some of these other fundamental problems. Thank you very much. I thought that was a very lively discussion. And well, thank you.
Thank you very, very much to our panelists. As a little gift from the festival, please accept these scarves as a thanks for a wonderful panel. Thank you for all your patience. Deep apologies to those we didn't get to. Please go over to the book signing desk. We're inviting the whole panel over to the book signing desk if you wouldn't mind. So we have a tea break now. Please take your rubbish with you and pop it in the bins. We're so grateful. We'll be back here for Kashmir Chronicles of Exile at 5 o'clock. Thank you so much.